Thank you all for coming. This first panel this morning is on states, territories, and citizens. We have 3 speakers today who I'll introduce each in turn. Each of the papers will be 20 minutes. And whatever questions you have, we'll hold for Q&A at the end of the presentations, and we'll ask them one by one. So our first speaker this morning is Kevin Martin. Professor Martin is an assistant professor of Near Eastern languages and cultures at Indiana University. He received his PhD in Middle East history from Georgetown University and is an expert of Syria. He has a forthcoming book entitled, it's going to be coming out in January, so we're looking forward to that, entitled Syria's Democratic Years, Citizens, Experts, and Media in the 1950s. For today, he is going to be speaking about a state without citizens, the tragedy of Syrian history. Professor Martin?
Actually, use the podium.
Use the podium?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Can everyone hear me? During the uprising of 1976 to 1982 against the Hafiz al-Assad regime, Zakaria Tamer, the Syrian master of the allegorical short story, published Tigers on the 10th Day. In this story, a recently captured tiger is placed in a zoo cage, where he encounters an animal trainer who is pleased to demonstrate to his assistants the most effective means of breaking wild beasts. Over 9 days of carefully calibrated manipulation, coercion, and humiliation, the proud, free tiger is rendered docile and conditioned to eager and unquestioning servitude. On the morning of the 10th day, this broken creature becomes a muwatin, or citizen, and the cage in which he has been confined becomes a city. Tamer's use of the term muwatin to describe the tiger's new state signifies the citizen's transformation from the sovereign subject of politics to the object of authoritarian mobilization. The necessary precondition, I argue, for the accomplishment of the post-war period's most significant macro-historical change, the establishment and consolidation of authoritarian regimes. And Tamer's knowing use of a pedagogical metaphor, the animal trainer's education of both the tiger and his assistants, is, I argue, the key to understanding this process. In February 1954, Syria embarked on an experiment, reestablishing parliamentary democracy via the region's first free and fair elections, including previously banned parties from across the political spectrum, the repeal of draconian press censorship, and enabled by the army's pledge to return to the barracks and refrain from politics. The ensuing 4 years, retrospectively designated the democratic years, witnessed a flourishing of public discourse, displaying intense hopes and anxieties about the future of Syria and the region. State publications and a national broadcasting service established under former dictator Abiba Shishakli, in conjunction with new privately owned periodicals, created unprecedented opportunities for those wielding professional expertise and harboring developmental aspirations to reach mass audiences, and to transform their otherwise elite discourse into a pedagogical project, the Tutelage of Citizens. The immediate purpose of this discourse was the construction of 2 subjects, the modern expert and the citizen, who formed a symbiotic relationship at the core of the developmental project. These experts articulated or exemplified complementary aspects or virtues of civic republican citizenship, practiced through the governing of the self, the family, and one's fellow citizens. Consumed by the perceived urgency of development, Syria's modern experts displayed a profound anxiety that many, if not most, of their countrymen were not up to the task of practicing citizenship, a fundamental premise of colonial thought. Thus, the most urgent and pervasive social problem under discussion was deviations from the norms of urban, literate, gendered, republican citizenship. As the oft-repeated goal of this expert media was the moral and material uplifting of Syria's population, It constituted, I argue, a specific genre of pedagogical literature, a mirror for citizens. Three public figures were key to this process. Najat Kasab Hassan, popularly known as the radio attorney, upheld the civilizing influence of the citizen's service to socioeconomic institutions like the family, community, and state by constructing the law-abiding patriarchal citizen. The physician Sabri al-Qabani affirmed the citizen's engagement with and triumph over natural phenomena like disease and sexual desire to construct the rational and heteronormative conjugal citizen. The final and most significant figure was a professional army officer, Adnan al-Malki. A massive media campaign mounted after al-Malki's death championed strength and exalted the redemptive power of the martial citizen's sacrifice on behalf of state and nation. In the process, it valorized army officers' political ambitions, thereby providing powerful institutional support for long-present authoritarian and anti-democratic impulses in Syrian politics. At the time of his death, Colonel Adnan al-Malki was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Syrian Army. A charismatic, forceful, and highly visible figure among his generational cohort in the armed forces, al-Malki was virtually unknown to the Syrian public during his lifetime. His relative obscurity ended on April 23, 1955, when a military police sergeant tasked with protecting him and other dignitaries attending a soccer match at Damascus's National Stadium fired 2 shots into the colonel's head and immediately turned the gun on himself. Within hours, state media reported that the assassin, Yunus Abdurrahim, was a member of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, or SSNP, and began fevered speculation about Abdurrahim's motives, the existence of co-conspirators, and the identity of the crime's ultimate authors. The SSNP was resolutely anti-communist and viewed Baghdad rather than Cairo as Syria's natural ally. With some reservations, the SSNP also looked favorably upon the role of the United States in the region. In sum, the party's views were anathema to the coalition of Nasrists, Ba'athists, and communists who held a majority of the army's staff and command positions. Soon Syria plunged into political chaos as leftist army officers and their allies in parliament pressured the government into establishing an extraordinary military tribunal that could operate unhampered by niceties like habeas corpus, arrest warrants, prohibitions against the mistreatment of suspects, and strict rules of evidentiary procedure. The tribunal immediately cleansed the armed forces of SSNP members and arrested hundreds in a nationwide dragnet. Medical care and legal representation were systematically withheld from arrestees, and military intelligence interrogators subjected those most closely associated with Abdurrahim to electrical shocks, sleep deprivation, the extraction of fingernails, simulated drowning or waterboarding in today's parlance, the threat of sexual assaults against family members, and repeated beatings to obtain confessions and statements incriminating others. As a result, more than 140 party members were charged with a remarkable array of capital crimes. The military prosecution alleged that the SSNP senior leadership had collectively resolved to kill al-Malki because he was the most significant obstacle to their plans to seize control of Syria's armed forces and ultimately the state. Once in control of Syria, it was claimed, the SSNP would steer the country toward alignment with the United States, membership in the Baghdad Pact, and the appeasement of Israeli occupation and aggression. These events were accompanied by a propaganda onslaught, as Syrian periodicals of every stripe provided lurid details from the confessions of the accused. By such means, Syrian state and private media othered the defendants, who were depicted as subhuman, monstrous creatures displaying repulsive and terrifying defects of thought, deed, and character. Simultaneously, the campaigns surrounding al-Malki's life and death effaced the historical flesh and blood mortal replacing him with a sacralized, deathless archetype of manliness, selfless courage, joyful sacrifice, and the eternal guardianship of Arab sovereignty. At its first session, the tribunal seized the SSNP's assets, declared the licensed political party to be a clandestine criminal organization inimical to public order and to the Syrian constitution, and charged it as a body with conspiring to overthrow the government and dissolve the Syrian state. A grand piece of judicial theater, the tribunal's proceedings were the first Soviet-style show trial in Syria, a mass media spectacle featuring the exposition of elaborate international conspiracy theories, coerced confessions, the condemnation of friends, relatives, and colleagues, and the berating and intimidation of defendants, witnesses, and attorneys. By operating on the presumption of collective and associative guilt, the tribunal made a significant departure from both major currents, the Islamic and the Western European, of Syria's legal tradition, and embraced a premise at the core of totalitarian systems of justice. Ultimately, two of the alleged conspirators, Sergeants Fadia Makhlouf, who, by the way, was the first cousin of the mother of the current president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and Abdel Monim Daboussi, were executed by firing squad. An unsigned editorial in the Defense Ministry Weekly Al Jundi urged readers to dispel any sympathies, as, and I'm quoting, "The chest shattered by the firing squad's bullets were not those of citizens, but those of enemies who were excommunicated from their previously consecrated state the moment they joined the SSNP and thereby bound themselves to the colonialists." Similarly, vindictive pieces echo the dehumanization of SSNP members, recounting the cries of joy raised when the bullets entered the loathsome bodies of the traitors. Over the coming months, a variety of discursive, performative, and material forms of commemoration transfigured Adnan al-Malki into the Martyr of Arabism. Paeans to al-Malki's memory, in the form of poetry, essays, and public addresses, shared common themes located at the boundaries of the natural and the supernatural. Chief among them were assertions of the martyr's immortality, the transformative properties of his blood, his preternatural courage and strength, and the spiritual, but non-sectarian, nature of his mission, earning him the status of the martyr of all the Arabs, Muslim and Christian alike. Proof of al-Malki's lifelong dedication to this Arab cause was found in his voluntary service with the Arab League's Army of Salvation in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Accordingly, soldiers published hundreds of stories about service under al-Malki's command in Palestine, including lauding the remarkable leadership that won the devotion and admiration of all. Physically substantial public artifacts also commemorated al-Malki. 2 months after his murder, the Damascus Municipal Authority announced the naming of a major north-south thoroughfare by bisecting the city's newest and most stylish residential neighborhood in his honor. 2 years later, the traffic circle at the northern terminus of this boulevard was designated Adnan al-Malki Square and redesigned to accommodate the martyr's final resting place. A massive memorial complex complete with plaza, Paris-style, eternal flame, and honor guard. On June 30th, 1955, the Syrian state mounted the first of many al-Malki Day celebrations. These and other events honoring al-Malki were gradually incorporated into the militaristic commemorative calendar that the Syrian state had observed each spring and summer since independence. And the commemorations of al-Malki continued in the decades after his death. Today, the most visible products of this process are the addition of a large bronze statue to the square already bearing al-Malki's name, and the renaming of the adjacent upscale neighborhood in his memory. But more significantly, the discourse inspired by Adnan al-Malki's sacrifice affirmed a particular conception of citizenship. First, it implied that true citizenship included a specific set of ideological commitments. The incessant celebration of the redemptive power of sacrifice also gave meaning to politically motivated violence and produced a heroic new representation, the martial citizen. This reconceptualization of the model citizen reveals the slippage from the self-abnegation of domestic and community service to self-sacrifice under arms. For the militarization of citizenship flows from the unforgiving logic of developmentalism in the nationalist mode, which imbues such acts with the character of a secular sacrament. Other effects of the al-Malki affair were momentous and toxic. The Syrian army rescinded its pledge to return to the barracks and abstain from politics. As a corollary, the emerging hegemony of military intelligence and the normalization of that institution's brutal practices further corrupted Syrian politics, which increasingly, in the words of Hisham Sharabi, assumed a pathological character, becoming a vengeful zero-sum game that frequently ended with the terrorizing, imprisonment, exile, or execution of arbitrarily designated enemies. Finally, the relative ease with which the army repeatedly compelled Syria's elected officials to dilute, share, or cede their office's constitutional authority and prerogatives revealed the weakness and fragility of Syria's democratic institutions and presaged their ultimate demise. Media coverage of the Malki affair also reanimated and sustained perceptions that the country was the focus of a vast, sinister conspiracy, and that its modern historical experience was best understood as a monochromatic morality play. Yet another victim of the Malki affair was the rule of law. The extraordinary tribunal provided a facade of legality for a campaign of ideologically informed vengeance, subordinating one of the foundational principles of representative government to immediate political advantage. In this way, the tribunal set a baleful precedent for future treason trials in Syria and for comparable proceedings elsewhere in the region, like the People's Courts in post-1958 Iraq. In addition to all of the other punitive measures it imposed, the tribunal permanently stripped many defendants of their civil rights. This practice, which became depressingly common under the post-1963 Ba'ath regimes, transformed citizenship from an inalienable condition to a privilege enjoyed at the pleasure of the regime. The state-sponsored martyrology of Adnan al-Malki bore several additional long-term consequences for Syrian political culture. Once a massive, prolonged, state-sponsored propaganda campaign just demonstrated that al-Malki, a relatively obscure professional soldier of few documented ideological pronouncements, could be ensconced in official memory as the Martyr of Arabism, other possibilities arose. When Hafez al-Assad's eldest son, Basil, died in a 1994 car accident, he was almost immediately declared the martyr of the nation. Given Basil's centrality to the future plans of his father's regime, lavish and prolonged ceremonies of official mourning were perhaps inevitable. Yet the specific form and content of these commemorations, as well as the scale of hyperbole surrounding them, would have been unthinkable without the al-Malki template so conveniently at hand. In this sense, al-Malki's cult of the dead almost certainly provided pointers for the mass simulation of emotion that was at the core of the live Hafez al-Assad's personality cult in the 1980s. After the democratic years, the project of shaping citizens dramatically expanded in scope and ambition, and was pursued with increasingly coercive, totalitarian means. By the 1990s, it appeared to many observers that the Assad regime had completed this transformative project, producing malleable and loyal citizens on a mass scale. Yet the critics of the Arab world's authoritarian politics have argued that one cannot speak of citizens in countries where the ruling powers cannot see them as autonomous possessors of agency, but see instead objects of governmentality. The grotesque product of this authoritarian vision is analyzed in Lisa Wadeen's study of Hafiz al-Assad's personality cult, which produced armies of docile citizens compelled to participate in the politics of public dissimulation, acting as if they venerated Syria's late president and as if they were his obedient children. Finally, Zakaria Tamer's Tigers on the 10th Day, if I can return to it once again, renders this outcome allegorically. On the 8th day of the tiger's instruction, his trainer orders him to applaud enthusiastically and sincerely in response to a speech. Addressing his fellow citizens, the trainer delivers a brief declaration of eternal steadfastness in the face of hostile forces that is a sublime parody of the turgid speeches delivered countless times by the region's populist authoritarian rulers. This, the tiger's penultimate lesson, was preceded by commands to behave as if he were a member of other species, mewing like a kitten and braying like a donkey for his food. This trope, the totalitarian ambition to transform nature, appears so frequently in Tamer's stories that it prompted the late poet and literary critic Muhammad al-Maghlut to compare Tamer to Charles Darwin. The latter, quote, showing how humans developed from monkeys, and the former, how humans could be manipulated into becoming monkeys. But to state the obvious, Syrians are not monkeys. Even when their designation as citizens had long since been stripped of meaning, they courageously staged peaceful protests in defiance of one of the most ruthless regimes on earth. At the risk of sounding naive, I express the hope that the collective aspirations that motivated Syria's brief experiment with democratic governance in the 1950s will inspire what Svetlana Boym has called prospective nostalgia, enabling that unhappy country's citizens to reclaim their status as sovereign political beings and agents of their own destinies.